So today's story is about the Last Supper and Jesus being arrested. Now, at this time, Jesus knew what was going to happen to him. He knew what was coming. He knew the cross was coming. And we sort of know that too. We've heard a little bit of the stories before, and we know that. But at that time, the disciples didn't know that. They didn't know that Jesus was headed to the cross. And so Jesus was trying to prepare his disciples to understand the things that were going to take place. He wanted them to understand that these things had to take place. Jesus knew it, but they didn't. So Jesus called his disciples together to have a meal. And the meal they were going to have was a very special meal. It was called the Passover. And maybe you've heard of this meal. It was a meal that the Israelites would have at a certain time of year, and it was a meal of remembrance. They were remembering a very special time in their history. It was a time when God saved them from the land of Egypt. The Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, and God brought them out of there. And just before they left Egypt, you might remember, they had this big feast. They killed lambs, and they ate them together. And so the people, over the years, they would continue to celebrate this Passover feast so that they could remember that their God was mighty and he could save them. So Jesus called his disciples together to have this meal. And so the disciples were together in a room having this special feast together, and they were eating and they were drinking. And as they did this, Jesus wanted to give them a special message. He wanted to start to prepare them for what would happen next. And so he took some bread in his hands and he held it up in front of them and he said, "Just like I break this bread, that's also going to happen to my body. Just like I break this bread, that will happen to my body." And he also took a cup, and the cup had wine in it. And he took that cup, and in front of them, he poured it out, and he said, "And like this wine comes out of this cup and is poured out, my blood is also going to be poured out for you." So you might have heard of this before. And in fact, one of you guys just gave us this yesterday. Maybe you've seen this before. This is a picture of the Last Supper, and people like to hang it in their homes, or maybe you've seen it in buildings before. And this is a picture of the story we're doing today. Jesus was preparing his disciples to understand that his body would be broken and his blood would be poured out for them. Jesus was also preparing us for this message too, because maybe you've heard of this before, but a lot of churches today still celebrate the feast that Jesus was giving the disciples. We don't call it the Passover anymore. We call it the Lord's Supper or communion or Eucharist. And so a lot of churches still today celebrate this meal with their people. They'll break bread and give it to the people, and they'll pour out wine or grape juice. And as they do that, they're remembering. And just like the Passover, when the Israelites would remember that God was a Savior and brought them out of Egypt, this was a message to God's people to remember why Jesus had come into this world and who he was. And now as the disciples were together having this meal, Jesus also began to explain to them even more things. And these things didn't sound very nice. He said to them, "Very soon, I'm going to be taken away from you. Very soon, I'm going to be gone. And you guys are going to scatter. You guys are going to run away when I'm gone." And the disciples were kind of disturbed by this, and they thought, "No, Lord, I'm not going to run away. I'm going to stick beside you. I'm your friend. I won't run away. And Peter was the most boldest. He said, no, Lord, I will go with you even unto death. And to that, Jesus replied, actually, Peter, you are going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. Sometime in the future, you're going to deny me. You're going to say, I don't know that guy. 3 times before the rooster crows. Peter probably didn't like to hear that, and he probably didn't really understand it, and all the disciples didn't really understand what Jesus was talking about. And their minds were probably turning, trying to figure things out. But Jesus also said to them something even more difficult and more challenging. You see, Jesus already knew what was in the heart of Judas. He already knew what Judas was up to. And so he said to his disciples also at this time, one of you here is going to betray me. And his disciples, of course, were looking around and going, is it I, Lord? Me? Maybe him, but not me. And they were looking around, wondering who it was. But only one of them knew for sure it was him. And that was Judas. And so Judas, at some point, he left the meal, just as Jesus had predicted, and he went on his way to go and betray Jesus. After having a meal together, the disciples left the place where they were at. They left that room. And the disciples and Jesus, they had a special place where they liked to go. A special place outside that was quiet. They could get away from the crowds. They could get away from the village. And they liked to go there to encourage each other. Jesus would encourage them and teach them at that time. And he would also pray. This place was called the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane. And so on that evening, Jesus brought his disciples there, and they came together and they prayed. Jesus wanted some time alone from them, and so he went off at a little bit of a distance, and he started to pray. He prayed to God, and he was worried. He knew it was going to happen, but he also knew that he had to do it. He knew that he had to go to the cross. Now, while he was praying, the disciples were off in the garden, and Jesus came back to them. And when he came back to them, they were fast asleep. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping?" And the disciples, they woke up and they said, "Oh, sorry, Lord. We'll stay awake." And so Jesus goes back again on his own to pray some more. And then he comes back to the disciples, and they're sleeping again. And this happened 3 times. 3 times he went back and forth, and the disciples were sleeping. His disciples did not understand yet what was going to happen. But Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen, and that's why he was praying. He was praying to God that he could have the strength for what he had to do. He knew that he had to do his Father's will. He had to do what his Father had asked him to do, and that was to go to the cross. And so as they were all together in Gethsemane, and it was evening, and it was dark, and they were in this quiet little area, all of a sudden, their silence was broken, and a mob came in. And the leader of that mob was none other than Jesus' friend, Judas. Now, the disciples were probably afraid in that moment and wondering what's going on. But Jesus was calm. He knew it was coming. And so he looked at Judas as as Judas came upon them, leading this crowd of men with swords and clubs, ready to attack, Jesus calmly looked at Judas and said, "Friend, do what you have come to do." Do what you have come to do. Now, Judas had a plan for that mob to arrest Jesus, and he had told them, there will be a signal. I will signal to you which one you need to arrest. And this is how you're going to know which one to arrest. He said to them, the one that I kiss is the one that you need to arrest. The one that I come over to and I'll give him a kiss on the cheek to greet him. That was a greeting that they did to each other back in those days. And Judas had told the mob, the one that I give this greeting to, that's Jesus. That's the one you have to arrest. Now just think about that for a moment. Think about that. A kiss. A kiss is it's a sign of love. It's a sign that you really, truly love someone. Think about the people you kiss. Probably your mom or your dad or grandma. I hope not your girlfriend or boyfriend. Not yet. But when you do kiss someone, it shows that you love them. And now Judas was using a kiss to betray his friend. And that's exactly what he did. He came into the Garden of Gethsemane with that mob and with torches and swords and clubs, and they came at Jesus, and he walked up to Jesus, and he said, "Lord," and gave him a kiss. Now, the disciples, they didn't like this. They saw the mob, and they wanted to defend their Lord, and Peter was always the most bold, and so he pulled out his sword to protect Jesus, and he came at one of the men who had a sword too, and he took a swipe at him, cutting off the man's ear. Ouch. And that probably would have set off a big battle, and it could have happened. There could have been knives flying, clubs swinging, fists. It could have been a royal rumble. But Jesus knew that didn't have to happen, and it shouldn't happen. That was not the way that he was going to go. And so Jesus calmed his disciples down and said no. And in fact, he even picked up the man's ear. It was cut off. A little bit gross, but he picked it up off the ground, and he came to the man who's holding the side of his head and some blood, and he healed him in that moment, putting his ear back into place. Jesus was calm, but his disciples were worried. They didn't understand. And just as Jesus predicted, his disciples fled. They had no idea what was going on. They couldn't process these things. They didn't understand what was Judas doing? Why was he here? Why was this mob here? Why was this happening? But Jesus calmly gave himself up. He didn't struggle. He didn't fight. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He gave himself up. And those men, they bound him up. They arrested him. And they took him away. The disciples fled, just as Jesus predicted. And Jesus was taken away and arrested. And so this is, again, a little bit of a low spot in the Bible, isn't it? We're leaving you at a low spot again. Jesus is now bound. He's being taken away. He's now a prisoner. But we learned a lot about Jesus today, didn't we? We learned even more things as we try to answer this question. Who is this Jesus? Who is this Jesus? We learned that Jesus knew that bad things were going to happen to him. He knew that He was heading towards a likely death. He knew that that was going to happen, and he knew that he had to do it. We also learned that he wants us to remember what was going to happen to him. He wants us to remember always this story. He wants us to remember that when we see bread broken and wine poured out or grape juice poured out, that just like that bread broke and the wine poured out, his body was broken and his blood would be shed, poured out for us. I hope that's something that you can think about and something that you could really just ponder in your mind. Wow, Jesus was willing to go to a death. He was willing to be broken and his blood spilled for me and for you. And I think that there's a little bit of good news in that. It sounds really bad and it sounds really sad, but there's good news for that. And in our coming stories, as we head towards Easter, we're going to explain that a little bit more. We're going to work with that so that we can really understand why Jesus went to the cross. That's my story for today, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you followed along. You can always replay it if you misunderstood something. But we'll be back again next week, and we'll keep going with this story, and we'll keep trying to answer this question: who is this Jesus?